The loner rancher stood on that windswept platform, heart pounding, expecting a plain woman who'd settle for his broken life. Instead, she stepped off that train like a vision from another world. Too beautiful, too elegant, too perfect to be real. His first thought? She'd made a terrible mistake. His second? She'd leave before sunset. But when her emerald eyes met his across that dusty station, something shifted in the frozen wasteland of his soul. What he didn't know, she was running from something far darker than loneliness. This is their story of secrets, survival, and a love that would set the Wyoming territory ablaze. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that carved through Wyoming territory in the winter of 1882 didn't just bite, it devoured. It tore across the barren hills like the breath of something ancient and hungry, stripping the land down to bone and stone, leaving nothing soft, nothing forgiving. The kind of wind that reminded a man he was small, temporary, alone. Silas McCord had stopped fighting that wind years ago. He stood at the edge of his property, 50 acres of hard-scrabble grazing land that rolled out toward the horizon in waves of brown grass and gray rock. The cabin behind him was small, weathered, built with his own hands from timber he'd hauled down from the Black Hills. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life for miles in any direction. No neighbors, no friends, no family. Not anymore. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple, colors that might have been beautiful if Silas had allowed himself to see beauty anymore. But beauty required hope, and hope was a luxury he'd buried alongside his parents and his younger sister 6 years prior. Cholera had swept through their homestead like wildfire, taking them in the span of a single brutal week. His father had gone first, then his mother 2 days later. Little Rebecca had held on the longest, her small hand gripping his until the very end. He'd buried them on the hill overlooking the valley. 3 wooden crosses, 3 stones, 3 reasons he worked himself to exhaustion every single day, so exhausted that when he finally collapsed into bed each night, he wouldn't have the energy to remember their faces. Silas was 32 years old, and he felt ancient. He turned back toward the cabin, his boots crunching through the frost-hardened earth. He was a tall man, lean but strong, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. Women in Red River Junction used to look at him with interest, back when he went to town more than twice a year, back when he could still smile without it feeling like a lie. Now when he rode in for supplies, people nodded politely and left him alone. They knew what grief looked like. They knew better than to prod. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in the stone hearth he'd built himself. The space was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, shelves lined with supplies. Everything functional, nothing decorative, no photographs, no mementos. The past was a weight he couldn't carry and still function, so he'd locked it away in the deepest chamber of his heart and thrown away the key. He ladled stew from the pot hanging over the fire, rabbit he'd snared that morning, vegetables from the root cellar, water from the creek. It tasted like sustenance, nothing more. He ate standing up, staring at the flames, letting the heat soak into his bones. This was his life. This was what remained. And some nights like this one, when the wind howled with particular fury and the silence pressed against his skull like a physical thing, Silas wondered if this was all there would ever be. Work, solitude, survival. Until one day, the land took him too, and someone would find his bones scattered across these hills, claimed by the same wilderness that had claimed everything else he'd loved. The thought didn't scare him. It almost comforted him. Almost. But there was something else, too. Something he barely admitted even to himself in the darkest hours of night. A hollow ache that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the human need for connection. He was tired of talking to himself. Tired of the echo of his own footsteps. Tired of waking up every morning to a world where not a single person cared whether he lived or died. He missed conversation, laughter, the simple presence of another soul. 3 months ago, in a moment of weakness he still couldn't fully explain, Silas had ridden into Red River Junction and done something he'd sworn he'd never do. He'd answered a mail-order bride advertisement, The notice had been tacked to the wall of Brennan's general store, one among dozens fluttering in the draft every time someone opened the door. Most were for land sales, livestock auctions, wanted posters, but this one had caught his eye. Matrimonial Correspondence Society. Respectable women seeking honest marriage with Western gentlemen. Write to us with your particulars. Boston, Massachusetts. Silas had stared at that notice for a full 10 minutes, feeling like a fool. Mail-order brides were for desperate men, weren't they? Men who couldn't find wives the normal way. Men who were too old, too poor, too broken to attract a woman through conventional means, which described him perfectly. He'd copied down the address, folded the paper into his pocket, and ridden home feeling both ridiculous and oddly hopeful. It had taken him 3 weeks to write the letter. He'd gone through 7 drafts, burning each one in the fireplace when the words came out wrong, too cold, too desperate, too revealing. Finally, he'd settled on blunt honesty. My name is Silas McCord. I'm 32 years old, owner of a cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory. I have no family. I have no fortune. I can offer hard work, a roof, food on the table, and respect. I cannot promise romance or fancy words. I have forgotten how. But I can promise honesty and whatever love I am still capable of learning. If this is enough, write back. He'd sealed it before he could change his mind and mailed it from Red River Junction with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation churning in his gut. That had been in January. For 2 months, he'd heard nothing. He'd convinced himself it was for the best, that no woman in her right mind would respond to such a graceless, joyless proposal. He'd gone back to his routine, pushing the whole thing from his mind. Then in March, a letter arrived. Mrs. Brennan had handed it to him with a knowing smile, and Silas had shoved it in his coat pocket without looking at it until he was miles outside town, alone on the trail. His hands had actually trembled as he opened it. Dear Mr. McCord, your letter has reached me, and I find your honesty refreshing in a world of false promises. My name is Marina Vale. I am 26 years old, unmarried, and seeking a new life in the West. I do not require romance or eloquence, only a partnership built on mutual respect and honest work. Your offer is more than enough. I accept. I will arrive on the first train of the season. I trust you will meet me at Red River Junction Station. With sincere regards, Marina Vale, Rena Vale. That had been 6 weeks ago. The trains didn't run through winter. The mountain passes were too treacherous. But spring had arrived early this year, melting the snows faster than usual, and word had reached the territory that the rail line had reopened. The first train would arrive in Red River Junction tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow. Silas set down his empty bowl and sank into the chair by the fire, rubbing a hand over his face. What the hell had he done? What was he thinking, bringing a stranger into his life, into his home? What if she took one look at him and fled? What if she was impossible to live with? What if he was? What if this was the worst mistake he'd ever made? But beneath the anxiety was something else, something fragile and barely acknowledged. Hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, this cabin wouldn't feel so much like a tomb anymore. That maybe he could remember how to be human again, how to share space with another soul without feeling like he was betraying the dead. He stayed by the fire until it burned low, then finally dragged himself to bed. Sleep came in fragments, restless and shallow, full of dreams where he stood on a train platform and everyone who stepped off turned to dust the moment they touched the ground. Morning arrived cold and clear. Silas was up before dawn, feeding the livestock, checking the fences, working with the kind of focused intensity he always employed when he needed to stop thinking. By noon, he'd bathed in the creek, water so cold it felt like knives against his skin, and changed into his cleanest shirt and trousers. He'd even trimmed his beard, though his hands were clumsy with the razor, and he nicked himself twice. He saddled his best horse, a sturdy roan mare named Rosie, and attached the small wagon he used for supply runs. The ride to Red River Junction took 2 hours. He spent most of it arguing with himself. Turn back. This is insane. You made a promise. Honor it. She's going to take one look at you and demand the next train east. Then at least you tried. Red River Junction wasn't much of a town. A main street lined with wooden buildings, a hotel, a saloon, a general store, a church, and the train depot at the far end. It existed primarily because it was one of the few places in the territory where the rail line could navigate the mountain passes. Ranchers and miners came from 100 miles in every direction to send and receive goods. When Silas arrived, the platform was already crowded with people waiting for the train. He recognized most of them. Mr. Hodges picking up equipment for his mine, the widow Thornton collecting a shipment of fabric for her dressmaking business, young Tommy Chen bouncing on his heels with excitement about a package from San Francisco. They all looked at Silas with barely concealed curiosity when he climbed down from the wagon. Word had spread, of course. Small towns had no secrets. Everyone knew the hermit rancher was meeting a mail-order bride. Silas ignored their stares and positioned himself at the edge of the platform, arms crossed, jaw tight. Waiting. The train was late. Of course it was. Another 20 minutes crawled by while Silas's heart hammered against his ribs and his palms grew damp despite the cool air. Then finally, a whistle in the distance, a plume of smoke rising against the mountains, the rumble of iron wheels on iron tracks growing louder, louder, until the locomotive burst into view like a mechanical dragon, belching steam and cinders. The train screeched to a halt with a hiss of brakes and a final blast of the whistle. Doors opened. People began to disembark. A businessman in a wool suit, a family with 3 small children, a grizzled prospector carrying a pickaxe. More faces, more bodies. None of them her. Silas's heart sank. She hadn't come. He'd been right. No woman would actually. Then she stepped onto the platform, and the entire world stopped. She was the most beautiful woman Silas McCord had ever seen. Not pretty, not lovely. Beautiful in a way that seemed impossible, almost unreal, like someone had taken every classical painting he'd ever glimpsed in old books and breathed them into life. She wore a traveling dress in deep green, tailored perfectly to her slender figure, with a matching hat perched at an elegant angle atop waves of auburn hair that caught the afternoon sun like polished copper. Her skin was porcelain pale, her features delicate, high cheekbones, a graceful neck, lips the color of rose petals. But it was her eyes that undid him. Emerald green, bright and intelligent, scanning the platform with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. When they found him, and somehow, impossibly, they did, she smiled. And Silas forgot how to breathe. She moved toward him with fluid grace, carrying a single carpet bag, navigating the crowded platform like she was gliding through a ballroom. Everyone watched her. Men stopped mid-sentence. Women whispered behind gloved hands. She seemed completely oblivious to the attention, her gaze locked on Silas. When she reached him, she stopped, studying him with those remarkable eyes. "Mr. McCord?" Her voice was soft, cultured, with an Eastern refinement that made him acutely aware of every callus on his hands, every rough edge he'd accumulated during years of hard living. He managed a nod, not trusting his voice. She extended one gloved hand. "I'm Marina Vale. I'm very glad to finally meet you." Silas stared at her hand for a beat too long before remembering to take it. Her grip was firm despite the delicate appearance. "Ma'am." The word came out hoarse. He cleared his throat. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I gave my word." Something flickered behind her smile, nervousness maybe, or something deeper. I hope I'm not a disappointment." A disappointment? This woman, asking him that. "No, ma'am, you're not." He realized he was still holding her hand and released it awkwardly. I brought the wagon. For your things." She gestured to the single bag at her feet. "This is all I have. One bag." For a woman dressed like she'd just stepped out of a Boston society party. Something about that struck Silas as strange, but before he could think too hard about it, she was speaking again. "Shall we?" She looked toward the wagon, then back at him, and he realized she was waiting for him to lead. "Right, yes, this way." He picked up her bag, surprisingly heavy for its size, and led her through the crowd to where Rosie and the wagon waited. The stairs followed them every step. Silas heard the whispers starting, saw the shocked expressions. "Did you see her? What's a woman like that doing with... Must be desperate, poor thing." He helped Marina into the wagon seat, his hands careful, almost afraid to touch her, as if she might shatter like porcelain. She settled herself with practiced elegance, smoothing her skirts, adjusting her hat. When he climbed up beside her and took the reins, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch," he said. "If you need to stop, or if you—" "I'll be fine, Mr. McCord." That small smile again. "I'm stronger than I look." He believed her. There was something in her eyes, a steel beneath the softness, that suggested she'd endured things that would break most people. They rode out of Red River Junction in silence, every eye in town tracking them, until they disappeared into the rolling hills. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Silas kept his attention on the road, hyper-aware of her presence beside him. The rustle of her dress, the faint scent of lavender, the way she sat so straight and composed despite the rough terrain. His mind was racing. She was too beautiful, too refined, too everything. What was she doing here? What was she running from? Because nobody who looked like that, who carried herself like that, chose a mail-order marriage to a broken rancher in the middle of nowhere unless they were running from something. "It's lovely," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. He glanced at her, startled. "Ma'am?" She gestured to the landscape around them, the hills rolling away in all directions, the vast sky, the mountains rising in purple shadows to the west. The land. It's beautiful. Harsh, but beautiful. Like it's honest. Does that make sense? I suppose it does. I've spent most of my life in cities, she continued, her voice thoughtful. Boston, mostly. New York for a time. Everything there is constructed, artificial. Here, everything is raw, real. She turned to look at him directly. I think I prefer real. There was something in the way she said it, something weighted, that made Silas wonder exactly what kind of artificial life she'd left behind. The ranch is simple, he heard himself say. Nothing fancy, just a cabin, some grazing land, the livestock. It's a hard life, ma'am. I won't lie about that. I don't expect easy, she replied. I expect honest. That's what you offered. That's what I accepted. They crested a hill, and she drew in a sharp breath. A small herd of pronghorn antelope scattered across the valley below, moving like liquid gold in the afternoon light. Oh, she whispered. Oh, they're magnificent. Silas found himself watching her instead of the antelope, seeing the genuine wonder in her expression. When was the last time he'd looked at this land and seen anything but work? You ride? He asked. Yes, I learned as a child. A pause. Though I imagine riding here is quite different from riding in Central Park. Probably. He hesitated, then added, There's an old mare at the ranch, gentle. You could ride her if you wanted, to see the property. Her face lit up. I'd like that very much. They talked more as they traveled, careful, polite conversation, both of them orbiting around the bigger questions that hung between them. She asked about the ranch, the livestock, the weather patterns. He asked about her journey west, whether the train had been comfortable, if she'd ever been this far from a city before. Neither of them asked the questions that really mattered. Why did you answer my letter? Why did you accept? What are you hiding? What are you afraid of? The sun was hanging low on the horizon when they finally reached the ranch. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and climbed down, then turned to help Marina. She accepted his hand, stepping down with that same fluid grace, her eyes taking in everything, the cabin, the barn, the chicken coop, the rolling hills beyond. This is it, Silas said, and heard the apology in his own voice. Not much, but it's wonderful. He blinked. Ma'am? She turned to him and her smile was radiant. It's perfect, Mr. McCord, truly. It's exactly what I needed. Needed, not wanted, needed. There it was again, that flash of something beneath the surface. But before Silas could pursue it, she was already moving toward the cabin, her skirt swishing around her ankles. May I see inside? Of course. He hurried past her to open the door, suddenly mortified by the sparse interior. What must she think, coming from Boston? This was probably smaller than her bedroom had been, and not nearly as— Oh, Silas. He froze. She'd used his first name. and her voice held something that sounded almost like relief. She stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking in the simple furnishings, the stone hearth, the hand-hewn shelves. It's lovely. It's a real home. It's pretty basic, he muttered. It's honest. She looked at him, and there were tears shining in those green eyes. Everything about it is honest. You have no idea how precious that is. Before he could respond, she wiped her eyes quickly, composing herself. I'm sorry, I'm being emotional. It's been a long journey. No need to apologize, ma'am. I cleaned out the trunk at the foot of the bed. For your things, and if you need anything else, we can ride into town. This is more than enough. She set her carpet bag down carefully. Thank you, Silas, for all of this, for taking a chance on a stranger. The way she said it, with such gravity, made him realize that whatever she was running from, whatever secrets she carried, they were heavy, soul-crushing, and she'd placed her entire future in the hands of a man she'd never met, betting everything on a single letter written by a lonely rancher in Wyoming. I'll start dinner, he said, desperate to do something with his hands. You must be hungry. Let me help. You don't have to. Please. She'd already removed her hat, already moving toward the hearth. I'd like to be useful. And besides, we should probably learn to work together, shouldn't we? If we're going to make this work. So they made dinner together. It was awkward at first, both of them too polite, too careful, dancing around each other in the small space. But gradually, they found a rhythm. She proved surprisingly capable, handling the vegetables with practiced efficiency while he prepared the venison. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was companionable. When they finally sat down to eat, the sun had set completely, and the cabin was lit by firelight and a single oil lamp. Marina ate with delicate manners but genuine appetite, and Silas found himself relaxing incrementally. This is delicious, she said. Did you hunt the meat yourself? Yes, ma'am. Yesterday morning. Please call me Marina. We're going to be married, aren't we? Ma'am seems too formal. Married. The word hung between them like a physical thing. I figure we should wait, Silas said carefully. Give you time to be sure. If you want to leave, I'll take you back to town. No questions, no judgment. She set down her fork and looked at him steadily. I'm not going to leave, Silas. I came here to stay. You say that now, but I say that because I mean it. There was steel in her voice now, that hidden strength surfacing. I don't make promises lightly, and I don't break them. They held each other's gaze across the table, and something shifted in that moment, an understanding, unspoken but profound. Whatever this was between them, whatever it would become, it would be built on truth, even if neither of them was ready to speak all their truths just yet. After dinner, Silas showed her where everything was. The well for water, the privy out back, the extra blankets in the trunk. He'd sleep in the barn tonight, he explained, give her privacy. That's not necessary, she protested. Yes, ma'am, Marina. It is. He grabbed a bedroll from the shelf. You've had a long journey. You need rest. She didn't argue further, and he saw gratitude in her eyes. At the door, he paused, turning back. Marina? Yes? I'm glad you came. Her smile was soft, sad, beautiful. So am I. Silas walked to the barn through the cool night, his mind spinning. One day. He'd known this woman for one day, and already his carefully constructed solitude felt fragile, ready to crack. In the barn, he made a nest in the hay, the familiar smell of horses and leather surrounding him. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Those green eyes, that mysterious sadness, the way she'd looked at his simple cabin like it was a palace. Who are you really, Marina Vale? And more importantly, what was she running from? In the cabin, Marina stood at the window, staring out at the dark hills, her hands trembling against the glass. She'd made it. She was here, hundreds of miles from Boston, in a place so remote that maybe, just maybe, they'd never find her. But as she turned away from the window, her gaze fell on her carpet bag, and the fear clawed at her throat again. Because inside that bag, wrapped in her spare dress, was a loaded pistol. And tomorrow night, she'd start checking the horizon for riders. They always came eventually. They always did. The first week passed in a strange dance of careful politeness and unspoken questions. Marina rose before dawn each morning, always dressed and composed by the time Silas returned from the barn. She learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly, too quickly for someone who claimed to have spent her entire life in cities. She knew how to milk the cow without being taught, how to gather eggs without startling the hens, how to knead bread dough with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Silas watched her when she wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the elegant woman in the fine green dress with the capable hands that worked alongside his own without complaint. She never mentioned her previous life beyond vague references to Boston. Never talked about family or friends or what had brought her west. And every time he started to ask, something in her expression, a flicker of fear, quickly hidden, stopped the words in his throat. They worked side by side during the days, their conversations growing easier but never quite breaking through to anything real. At night, Silas still slept in the barn despite Marina's gentle protests that he should reclaim his own bed. He told himself he was being respectful, giving her time to adjust. But the truth was darker than that. He was afraid. Afraid that if he got too close, if he allowed himself to hope for something more than mere companionship, she'd vanish like morning mist when the sun finally revealed whatever secret she was hiding. On the 8th day, everything changed. Silas was repairing fence posts on the eastern boundary when he heard hoofbeats approaching fast. He straightened, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped against the fence rail, then relaxed when he recognized his nearest neighbor, Frank Dawson, whose spread was 10 miles north. But Frank's face was grim as he reined in his horse. "Silas, got some news from town you need to hear." Something cold settled in Silas's gut. "What kind of news?" "Strangers came through Red River Junction yesterday. 3 men, well-dressed, asking questions." Frank shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. "They were asking about a woman. Auburn hair, green eyes. Came in on the spring train. Said her name was Eleanor Hartwell, and she's wanted for theft and murder back east." The world tilted sideways. "They had a poster," Frank continued. "Drawn portrait. Looked an awful lot like that bride of yours, Silas. I didn't say anything. Figure you deserve to hear it from me first. But they're asking everyone. Someone's going to talk eventually." Silas's mouth was dry. "These men. They say who they were?" "U.S. Marshal and 2 deputies. Official business, they claimed. Said the woman's dangerous, killed some banker in Boston, stole a fortune." Frank's eyes were sympathetic. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but you've always been square with me. Thought you should know they're coming." After Frank rode off, Silas stood frozen by the fence, his mind racing. Eleanor Hartwell, murder, wanted. The words wouldn't fit together with the woman who'd spent the past week making his cabin feel like a home again, who smiled at the sunrise and laughed when the chickens chased each other around the yard. But he thought about the pistol he'd glimpsed in her carpetbag that first night, when he'd been moving it to make space. The way she sometimes stared east with something like terror in her eyes. How she startled at sudden sounds. The fact that she'd brought only 1 bag, as if she'd left in a hurry. He'd known she was running from something. He just hadn't known what. Silas gathered his tools with shaking hands and headed back to the cabin. The afternoon sun was warm, but he felt cold all the way through. What was he going to do? Turn her in? Demand the truth? Pretend he didn't know and wait for the law to arrive at his doorstep? Marina was in the vegetable garden when he approached, her sleeves rolled up, dirt on her hands and face. She looked up with a smile that died the instant she saw his expression. "Silas, what's wrong?" He stopped 10 feet away, unable to move closer. "Who are you?" The color drained from her face. "What? Who are you really? And don't say Marina Vale, because I just heard a very different name from Frank Dawson." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet, wiping her hands on her apron. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but hollow. "What did he tell you?" "That there's a U.S. Marshal looking for a woman named Eleanor Hartwell, wanted for murder and theft." He forced himself to meet her eyes. "That she looks exactly like you." Marina, Eleanor, whatever her name was, closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but her voice didn't waver. I need you to listen to me, Silas, all the way through. And then you can decide what to do. I'm listening. She walked past him to the cabin, and he followed, his heart hammering. Inside, she poured water from the pitcher with trembling hands, drank deeply, then turned to face him. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. That part is true. But everything else they're saying, it's a lie. Tell me. So she did. Eleanor's voice was quiet but clear as she unraveled the story she'd been carrying like a weight around her neck. She'd been born to a moderately wealthy Boston family, her father a shipping merchant, her mother a society matron. Eleanor had been raised to be ornamental, to marry well, to grace the right parlors and bear the right children, but she'd always been too curious, too independent, too unwilling to pretend she was less intelligent than the men around her. At 23, she had attracted the attention of Richard Caulfield, one of Boston's most powerful bankers. 40 years old, politically connected, accustomed to getting everything he wanted. He'd courted her aggressively, showering her family with gifts and promises. Her parents had been thrilled. Eleanor had been terrified. He wasn't a kind man, she said softly, staring at her hands. Oh, he was charming in public, but in private there was something cold, calculating. He looked at me like I was a possession he meant to acquire. I told him no, multiple times, but Richard Caulfield wasn't accustomed to rejection. She took a shaky breath. He began making threats, subtle at first, mentioning how unfortunate it would be if my father's business encountered certain difficulties, how my younger sister's marriage prospects might suffer if rumors began to circulate. I still refused, so he escalated. 6 months ago, Eleanor explained, Caulfield had invited her to his office under the pretense of discussing a charitable contribution. She'd gone, hoping to reason with him one final time. Instead, he'd locked the door and made his intentions brutally clear. She would marry him, or he would destroy her family completely. I tried to leave. He grabbed me. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There was a struggle. He was stronger, but I was desperate. There was a letter opener on his desk. I got to it first. When he lunged at me, She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Silas's voice was rough. What happened, Eleanor? He fell, hit his head on the corner of the desk. There was so much blood. Her eyes were distant, seeing something Silas couldn't. I checked for a pulse. There wasn't one. I panicked. I knew how it would look, a woman alone in a powerful man's office, him dead at her feet. Who would believe it was self-defense? He owned half the police force. His friends controlled the courts. So she'd run. She'd grabbed what little money she'd brought, left through the back entrance, and made it home just long enough to pack a single bag. Her friend Sarah had been visiting, Sarah who'd been planning to travel west as a mail-order bride, who'd already made arrangements with the Matrimonial Correspondence Society. Sarah was dying, Eleanor said dully. Consumption. She had maybe 6 months left. She begged me to take her papers, use her identity. She said at least that way her plans would mean something, would save someone. Eleanor had stolen out of Boston that very night, using Sarah's name and ticket. By the time Caulfield's body was discovered the next morning, she was already on a train west, and by the time the accusations started flying, murder, theft of supposed bank documents she'd never touched, she was already Marina Vale, writing back to a lonely rancher's honest letter. I know how it sounds, she finished, her voice breaking. I know you have no reason to believe me, but I swear on everything I have left, Silas, it was self-defense. I'm not a murderer. I'm just someone who fought back and paid the price. The silence that followed was suffocating. Silas stood motionless, trying to process everything she'd said. A part of him, the logical part, knew he should ride to town immediately, inform the marshal, let the law sort it out. That was the right thing to do, the lawful thing. But another part of him, the part that had watched her laugh at the sunrise and sing softly while making bread and look at his broken-down ranch like it was paradise. That part couldn't reconcile the woman he'd come to know with the cold-blooded killer the law claimed she was. Say something, Eleanor whispered. Please. I believe you. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. What? I believe you. He moved closer, closing the distance between them. I've watched you for over a week. You're not a killer, Eleanor. You're someone who's been hurt and hunted, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be another person who fails you. Silas, they'll arrest you too. If you help me, you'll be... I don't care. You don't understand. Richard Caulfield was connected to senators, judges. I don't care, he repeated more forcefully. You came here for safety. You came here because I promised honesty and respect and whatever protection I could offer. I don't break my promises either, Eleanor. She was crying openly now, her composure finally cracking. Why? Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know? Because somewhere in the past week, his empty cabin had started feeling like a home again. Because her laughter had reminded him what joy sounded like. Because when he looked at her, he saw something he'd thought died with his family, the possibility of a future that wasn't just survival. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he said simply, because it's the right thing to do. And because you're not alone anymore. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Silas took one more step and hesitantly, awkwardly, pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened for half a heartbeat, then collapsed against him, crying into his shirt while he held her and wondered what the hell he was going to do when the marshal arrived, which, according to Frank, would be soon. Very soon. That night they sat together at the table long after dark, making plans by lamplight. The marshal would come. That was inevitable. The question was what they'd do when he did. Maybe I should just turn myself in, Eleanor said quietly. Face the charges, maybe with a good lawyer. With what money? And who's going to believe you over a dead man's powerful friends? Silas shook his head. No, they've already decided you're guilty. A trial would just be a formality before they hang you. She flinched at the word hang, but didn't argue. We could run, she suggested. Head west, to California maybe. Or north to Canada. They'd follow, and I can't leave the ranch indefinitely. The livestock would die. He rubbed his face tiredly. Besides, running would make you look guilty. I am guilty. Legally, I killed a man. Self-defense or not, the law won't see it that way. They sat in frustrated silence, both knowing there were no good options. Eleanor could run and spend her life looking over her shoulder. She could surrender and face a rigged trial, or she could stay and wait for the inevitable confrontation. All roads led to darkness. There's a fourth option, Silas said slowly. What? We get married. Tomorrow. In Red River Junction, with witnesses. He met her startled gaze. As my legal wife, they can't make you testify, and it'll be a lot harder for them to drag you off if you're a married woman with a husband defending you. Silas, that would tie you to me. If I'm convicted, then we'll face it together. His voice was steady. I'm not letting them take you without a fight, Eleanor. Legal wife gives us more standing, more protection. It's not much, but it's something. She stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face for something. Doubt, maybe, or regret. But Silas had made his decision. He'd spent 6 years letting fear and grief dictate his choices. Not anymore. Why are you doing this? She asked again, softer this time. Because you're the first person in 6 years who made me remember what hope feels like. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Because you deserve someone on your side. And because if they're going to come for you, they're going to have to go through me first. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she nodded. Okay, tomorrow. We'll do it tomorrow. They rode to Red River Junction at dawn, before the town fully woke. Reverend Matthews was surprised but willing, especially when Silas pressed extra money into his hand and asked for discretion. The ceremony was brief, quiet, witnessed only by Mrs. Matthews and old Henry Cooper, who swept the church. Eleanor wore her green traveling dress. Silas wore his cleanest shirt and the weight of the choice he'd made. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed Eleanor's cheek gently, feeling the tremor that ran through her. They signed the marriage certificate, Silas's hand steady, Eleanor's shaking slightly. The ink dried. The document was filed. They were married. On the ride back to the ranch, Eleanor was silent, staring at the simple gold band Silas had purchased from the general store, the only piece of jewelry the isolated town had to offer. It was too loose, but she twisted it around her finger like it was the most precious thing she'd ever worn. "You didn't have to do this," she said finally. "Yes, I did. You could still send me away, annul it, before it's too late." Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. "Eleanor, listen to me. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if we can stop what's coming. But I know that for the first time in 6 years, I wake up in the morning and feel something other than empty. You did that, and I'm not turning my back on you. Not now, not ever." She leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, and they sat like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other as the Wyoming sun climbed higher in the endless sky. The marshal arrived 3 days later. Silas was working on the roof, replacing rotted shingles, when he spotted the riders in the distance, 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of law enforcement. His stomach dropped, but his hand stayed steady as he climbed down the ladder. "Eleanor!" he called toward the cabin. "They're here." She emerged from the doorway, her face pale but composed. She'd known this was coming. They both had. She stood beside Silas as the riders approached, her hand finding his, their fingers interlacing. The lead rider was a tall man with a steel-gray beard and a marshal's badge gleaming on his coat. His eyes were hard as they raked over the ranch, settling on Eleanor with grim satisfaction. "That's her," one of the deputies said, a younger man with a pointed face. "That's Eleanor Hartwell." The marshal dismounted slowly, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Miss Hartwell, or should I say Miss Vale. Fancy finding you all the way out here." "Marshal?" Eleanor's voice was steady. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. My name is Eleanor McCord now. I married 3 days ago." The marshal's eyes narrowed, shifting to Silas. "That true?" "Yes, sir. We were married by Reverend Matthews in Red River Junction. I have the certificate inside if you need to see it." "Convenient timing." The marshal's voice dripped with suspicion. "You do know this woman is wanted for murder back in Boston? Killed a prominent banker, stole valuable documents." "I know what she's accused of," Silas replied carefully. "And I know my wife. She's no murderer." "Your wife," the marshal repeated mockingly. "And how long have you known her, Mr. McCord? A month? 2? "Long enough to know the truth when I hear it," the younger deputy spoke up. "We have a warrant for her arrest. You need to step aside and let us take her in." "Let me see the warrant." The marshal pulled a folded document from his coat and held it out. Silas read it carefully, his heart sinking. It was official, signed by a federal judge, charging Eleanor Hartwell with murder in the first degree and grand theft. His marriage certificate would provide some protection, but not enough to stop an arrest. "This warrant is for Eleanor Hartwell," Silas said slowly, handing it back. "My wife's name is Eleanor McCord. Different person." The marshal's expression darkened. "Don't play games with me, son. We all know who she is." "Then you'll need a warrant with her current legal name, and you'll need to prove that Eleanor McCord is the same person as Eleanor Hartwell." Silas's voice was calm, but his grip on Eleanor's hand tightened. "Until then, you're not entering my property without permission." The 3 lawmen exchanged glances. The marshal's jaw clenched. "You're interfering with federal law enforcement. That's a crime." "I'm protecting my wife's rights. That's my duty." The standoff stretched, tension coiling tighter with each passing second. Silas was acutely aware of the rifles on the lawmen's saddles, the pistols at their hips, the fact that he was outnumbered and outgunned. But he didn't move, didn't back down. Finally, the marshal spat into the dust. "You're making a mistake, McCord. Richard Caulfield had powerful friends. They want justice." "Justice," Eleanor spoke up suddenly, her voice ringing clear across the yard, "would be investigating what really happened instead of accepting the word of dead man's associates who profit from my guilt." The marshal's eyes hardened. "You claiming self-defense?" "I'm claiming the truth. Richard Caulfield attacked me. I defended myself. He fell and hit his head. It was an accident born of desperation, not murder. That'll be for a jury to decide." "A jury of his friends and business partners? In his city? I wouldn't survive long enough to see a courtroom." "That's not my concern. My job is to bring you in." The marshal remounted his horse, his deputies following suit. "I'll be back, Mrs. McCord, with the proper warrant. And when I return, you're coming with me whether your husband likes it or not." He wheeled his horse around, then paused, looking back at Silas. "One more thing. You keep helping her, you'll be charged as an accessory. You'll lose everything, your ranch, your freedom, maybe your life. Is she really worth that?" Silas looked at Eleanor, at the woman who'd fled across a continent to escape false accusations, who worked beside him without complaint, who smiled at sunrises and made his empty cabin feel like home. The woman he'd married 3 days ago in a desperate attempt to protect her from a corrupt system. "Yes," he said simply. "She is." The marshal's expression was almost pitying. "Then you're a fool." They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Silas and Eleanor standing together in the yard, still holding hands, both knowing the reprieve was temporary. "How long do we have?" Eleanor asked quietly. "A week, maybe less. Depends how fast they can get the paperwork amended." Silas turned to her, his expression grave. "Eleanor, this isn't over. They're going to come back, and next time they'll have everything they need to take you." "I know." She looked up at him, and there was something fierce in her eyes now, something that went beyond fear. "But I'm not going to make it easy for them, and I'm not going to let you sacrifice everything for me." "What are you thinking?" She pulled away from him, pacing across the yard, her mind clearly racing. When she turned back, her jaw was set with determination. "We need proof. Real evidence that what happened was self-defense. There must be something. Witnesses who saw Caulfield's temper, documents showing his threats, something that proves I'm telling the truth. Even if there is, how would we get it? We can't go back to Boston." "No, but we could write to someone who can." Eleanor's eyes lit up with desperate hope. "My sister, Catherine. She didn't believe the accusations. She tried to help me before I fled. If she could find evidence, testimony, anything that supports my version of events, it would take weeks for letters to reach Boston and return. We don't have that kind of time." "Then we make time." Eleanor grabbed his arms, her grip fierce. "Silas, I won't go to trial without a fight. If there's even a chance of proving my innocence, we have to try." He looked at her determined face and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the terrified woman who'd arrived 3 weeks ago. This was someone finding her strength, refusing to be a victim. "Okay," he said. "We'll write the letter today. But Eleanor, you need to understand, even with evidence, the system is rigged against you. Powerful men protect their own." "I know, but at least we'll have tried." She managed a small, sad smile. "Besides, I'm not alone anymore. You said so yourself." That night, they composed the letter together by lamplight, Eleanor's elegant handwriting covering page after page as she detailed everything that had happened, everything she needed Catherine to find. Silas added his own note at the end, introducing himself as Eleanor's husband and promising to protect her whatever the cost. They mailed it the next morning from Red River Junction, paying extra for the fastest possible delivery. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was something. Action instead of helpless waiting. The days that followed were strange, caught between normalcy and impending crisis. They worked the ranch together, falling into comfortable rhythms. Eleanor proved to be an excellent rider, taking to the old mare like she'd been born in the saddle. They'd ride out together in the early mornings, checking fences and livestock, and sometimes Eleanor would laugh at something, a bird's antics or the way the wind bent the grass, and Silas would find himself laughing with her, the sound rusty but real. At night they'd sit by the fire, talking about everything except the sword hanging over their heads. Eleanor told him about growing up in Boston, the books she'd loved, the art museums she'd visited. Silas shared stories about his family, memories he'd locked away for years, finding that speaking them aloud to Eleanor somehow made the grief less crushing. "Tell me about your sister," Eleanor asked one evening. "Rebecca. What was she like?" Silas stared into the flames, seeing a little girl with pigtails and a mischievous grin. "Wild. Fearless. She used to climb trees higher than any of the boys, come home with scraped knees and dirty dresses, and laugh at our mother's scolding." His voice softened. "She wanted to see everything, do everything. Used to say she'd travel the whole world someday, have adventures, refuse to be ordinary. She sounds wonderful." "She was." He paused. The cholera took her slowly. She was so scared, Eleanor. So small and scared, and there was nothing I could do. I held her hand and lied. Told her she'd be fine. That we'd go fishing when she felt better. That... His voice broke. Eleanor moved closer, taking his hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Silas." They sat in silence, their grief and fear twining together in the firelight. And when Eleanor finally went to bed, Silas didn't retreat to the barn. He made a bedroll by the fire instead, close enough to hear if she called out, close enough to protect her if danger came in the night, close enough to pretend they were a real married couple instead of two desperate people clinging to each other in a storm. On the 6th day after the marshal's visit, everything changed again. Silas was in the barn, mucking stalls. When Eleanor appeared in the doorway, he knew immediately something was wrong. Her face was stark white, her hands trembling. "There are riders," she said, "from the east, at least 6 of them." His blood turned to ice. He dropped the shovel and grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "How far? Maybe 2 miles? Moving fast. Too many for marshals on a routine arrest." This was something else. They ran to the cabin together. Silas barred the door, checked his ammunition, positioned himself by the window where he could see the approaching riders. Eleanor retrieved her pistol from the carpet bag, her hands steadier now that action was required. "Whatever happens," Silas said, not looking away from the window, "stay behind me. If shooting starts, get to the cellar. I'm not hiding while you..." "Eleanor." He turned to her, his expression fierce. "Please, if something happens to me, you run. Take my horse, ride north to Frank Dawson's place. He'll help you get to Canada. Promise me." She looked like she wanted to argue, but finally nodded. "I promise." "But Silas, don't you dare die protecting me. I couldn't bear it." The riders came into view, 6 men in dark suits riding expensive horses. Not lawmen, something worse. Silas's jaw clenched as they reined in about 50 yards from the cabin, keeping their distance. One man rode forward alone, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the distance. "Eleanor Hartwell, I know you're in there. My name is Marcus Thornton. I was Richard Caulfield's business partner. I'm here to offer you a deal." Eleanor appeared at Silas's side, her face set. "What kind of deal?" "Come back to Boston voluntarily. Confess to Richard's murder. I'll ensure your trial is fair, your sentence relatively light. 20 years instead of hanging. Your sister will be left alone, unharmed." Eleanor's gasp was sharp. "Catherine? What have you done to Catherine?" "Nothing. Yet." Thornton's smile was cold. "But if you continue to run, if you continue to spread lies about Richard, well, accidents happen. Young women traveling alone are vulnerable. It would be tragic if something befell her." Silas felt Eleanor sway beside him, felt the way her hand clutched his arm. They were threatening her sister. Of course they were. Powerful men always found the pressure points. "You have 24 hours to decide," Thornton continued. "Return with us, or your sister pays the price. After that, we burn your ranch to the ground and take you by force. Choose wisely, Mrs. McCord." They wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving Silas and Eleanor standing in shock. Eleanor's voice was hollow. "They'll kill her. If I don't surrender, they'll kill Catherine." "We don't know that." "Yes, we do." She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "I can't let my sister die because of me, Silas. I can't. I have to go back. You'll hang. At least Catherine will live." Her voice broke. "At least one of us will survive this." Silas pulled her into his arms as she sobbed against his chest, and he felt his own rage building, a fury unlike anything he'd known since his family died. These men with their money and power and casual cruelty, destroying lives because they could, because no one stopped them. Well, he was done letting evil men take everything he cared about. "No," he said firmly. "You're not surrendering, and they're not touching your sister." Eleanor pulled back, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Silas, there's no other way." "Yes, there is." His voice was steel. "We run. Tonight, before they come back. We ride west, hard and fast, and we don't stop until we're somewhere they can't find us. But the ranch is just land. You're my wife, Eleanor. You're what matters. He cupped her face in his hands. We run, we survive, and we find a way to clear your name from a distance. But I'm not letting them have you. Not now. Not ever. She stared at him, searching his eyes, and something passed between them. An understanding deeper than words. A commitment that transcended their hurried marriage. Okay, she whispered. We run. Together. They spent the remaining daylight preparing. Silas gathered supplies, food, ammunition, blankets, everything they could carry on 2 horses. Eleanor packed her carpet bag with essentials, including the pistol and what little money they had. They'd leave at midnight, under cover of darkness, and ride hard for the Black Hills where the terrain would make pursuit difficult. It was a desperate plan. But it was a plan. As the sun set, Silas took one last look around the cabin he'd built with his own hands. The home where he'd buried his grief and found it again transformed into something like hope. He thought of his parents, his sister, the family he'd lost. And he thought of Eleanor, the woman he'd known for less than a month, who'd become the most important person in his world. I'm sorry, Eleanor said softly from the doorway. I'm sorry for bringing all this into your life. Silas turned to her, and for the first time in 6 years he smiled, really smiled, with his whole heart. Don't be, he said. You're the best thing that's happened to me since I can remember. Whatever comes next, we face it together. She crossed to him, rising on her toes, and kissed him, soft, tentative, but real. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Silas realized with stunning clarity that somewhere between the train platform and this moment, he'd fallen in love with her, completely, irrevocably. Love. We should rest, he managed. Long ride ahead. But neither of them moved. They stood in the gathering darkness, holding each other, drawing strength for whatever lay ahead. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the hills, carrying the promise of freedom or ruin. By midnight, they'd find out which. Midnight came with a sky full of stars and a silence so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. Silas moved through the cabin one final time, his steps careful and deliberate. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of supplies being secured, the rapid beating of his own heart. He'd lived in this cabin for 6 years, built it with his own hands from raw timber and determination, and now he was walking away from it, possibly forever. But when he looked at Eleanor standing by the door, her carpet bag clutched in white-knuckled hands and fear etched across her beautiful face, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. Ready? He whispered. She nodded, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I wish there was another way. There isn't. Not one that keeps you alive. He shouldered the pack containing their supplies, then picked up his rifle. We move quiet and fast. No talking once we're outside. The horses are already saddled. They'd prepared everything hours ago. Rosie and the gelding he called Buck, both strong animals capable of carrying them through rough country. Silas had packed light, but smart. Dried meat, hardtack, coffee, ammunition, blankets, a canvas tarp for shelter. Enough to survive for weeks in the wilderness if necessary. He extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. For a moment they stood there, letting their eyes adjust, listening to the night sounds beyond the walls. Wind through grass. The distant call of an owl. Nothing else. Now, Silas breathed. They slipped out the back door, keeping low, moving toward the barn where the horses waited. The night air was cold enough to turn their breath to mist, and Eleanor shivered despite her heavy coat. Silas wanted to put his arm around her, offer warmth and comfort, but they needed their hands free and their attention sharp. The barn loomed ahead, a darker shadow against the star-filled sky. They were 20 feet away when Silas heard it, the soft nicker of a horse that wasn't his own. He froze, hand shooting out to stop Eleanor. She'd heard it too, her body going rigid beside him. Voices drifted from behind the barn, low, male, conversational. Should have just taken her when we had the chance. All this waiting around. Thornton wants her to come willingly. Says it plays better in court if she surrenders. She's not going to surrender. Anyone can see that. We're wasting time. Then we wait until dawn like he ordered, then we burn them out. Either way, she's going back to Boston in chains. Silas's blood turned to ice. They'd posted guards. Of course they had. Thornton hadn't trusted them to wait 24 hours. He'd stationed men to watch the ranch, probably hoping to catch them trying to run, which meant they were trapped. Eleanor's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing tight. He could feel her trembling, and it took every ounce of control not to curse aloud. They couldn't go forward to the horses. They couldn't go back to the cabin without being spotted, and come dawn, they'd be surrounded and outnumbered. Think. He had to think. Silas leaned close to Eleanor's ear, his lips barely brushing her hair. The creek. North side. Follow me. Slow. They backed away from the barn, inch by agonizing inch, using the cabin for cover. The guards' voices continued, oblivious. Silas thanked God for small mercies and the arrogance of hired guns who thought their targets were helpless. The creek that fed his property ran about 200 yards north of the cabin, cutting through a shallow ravine lined with cottonwoods and brush. The terrain was rough, the water ice cold at this time of year, but it offered cover and a path away from the ranch. If they could reach it unseen, they could follow it north for a few miles before cutting west toward the Black Hills. On foot, without horses or most of their supplies, it was a death sentence in the wilderness, and Silas knew it. But the alternative was watching Eleanor hang for a murder she'd committed in self-defense. They made it to the creek bank without being spotted. Silas paused at the edge, listening for any sign of pursuit, then helped Eleanor down the steep slope. She slipped once, dislodging a small cascade of dirt and stones, and they both froze, hearts hammering. But the guards' conversation continued unchanged. They hadn't heard. The creek water was even colder than Silas expected. So cold it felt like knives against his legs as he waded in. Eleanor gasped when the water hit her, her whole body shaking, but she didn't make another sound. They moved downstream slowly, using the water to mask their tracks, putting distance between themselves and the ranch. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Silas pulled them out on the far bank, into a dense thicket of brush where they could rest and reassess. Eleanor collapsed against a tree, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them clicking together. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly, stripping off his wet coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. "Get some distance before they realize we're gone." Silas, we don't have horses. We don't have supplies. How are we? One problem at a time. First priority is staying alive and free. We'll figure out the rest as we go. He helped her to her feet, and they began walking north, parallel to the creek, but staying in the tree line. Every step took them farther from everything Silas had built, everything he'd known for 6 years. But with Eleanor's hand in his, he discovered that he didn't care as much as he thought he would. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was a person. They walked through the night, Silas navigating by stars and instinct, Eleanor keeping pace despite her exhaustion and fear. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, they'd covered maybe 5 miles. Not nearly enough, but better than nothing. There, Silas pointed to an outcropping of rocks partially hidden by scrub pine. "We can rest there during daylight. Too dangerous to move in the open." The shelter was cramped and cold, barely large enough for both of them, but it offered concealment and protection from the wind. Silas positioned himself at the entrance where he could watch the trail below, while Eleanor curled up against the back wall, wrapped in his coat and her own, still shivering. "Try to sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." "You need rest too." "I'll sleep when we're safe." He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. "Right now, I need to make sure no one sneaks up on us." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then spoke in a small voice. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't come here, if I hadn't involved you—" "Stop." Silas turned to look at her, his expression fierce despite his exhaustion. "You came here because you had nowhere else to go. You came here because I offered you safety. None of this is your fault, Eleanor. The only people to blame are the men who framed you and the ones hunting you now." "But your ranch was just empty land until you arrived. You made it a home. You made me remember what it felt like to be alive." He moved closer, taking her frozen hands in his. "I meant what I said, Eleanor. You're what matters. Not the cabin, not the cattle, not any of it. Just you. She looked at him with those remarkable green eyes, bright with tears, and something else, something that made his heart stutter in his chest. How can you be so sure? You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brave and kind and stronger than you give yourself credit for. I know you laugh at sunrises and sing while you work and treat every living thing with gentleness. His voice roughened. I know that somewhere in the past few weeks, you became the most important person in my world. So yeah, I'm sure. Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him, desperate and fierce, her cold lips warming against his. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Silas realized with a jolt that they'd crossed some invisible line. This wasn't pretend anymore. This wasn't a marriage of convenience for legal protection. This was real. Get some rest, he managed, his voice hoarse. We have a long way to go. She finally closed her eyes, though Silas suspected she wouldn't actually sleep. He turned back to watching the trail, his mind racing through their limited options. They needed horses, supplies, and a destination far from Wyoming territory. Canada was the obvious choice. Across the border, beyond the reach of U.S. Marshals and Thornton's hired guns. But that was hundreds of miles north, through some of the roughest country in the West. On foot, they'd never make it, which meant they needed to find help. Someone willing to risk harboring fugitives, someone Silas could trust. Frank Dawson was the closest neighbor, but his ranch was east, back toward the men hunting them. Too risky. The other ranchers in the area were decent people, but most wouldn't risk their own necks for a stranger accused of murder. Silas didn't blame them. He probably wouldn't have either, before Eleanor. That left one option, and it was a long shot. 3 days' hard ride west, in the foothills of the Black Hills, lived a man named Jacob Running Bear. He was Lakota, one of the few who'd managed to keep his land after the treaty violations and forced relocations. Silas had met him years ago while tracking a mountain lion that had been killing livestock. Jacob had helped him, taught him tracking skills, and they developed a friendship based on mutual respect and few words. If anyone would help them disappear into the wilderness, it was Jacob. But 3 days on foot, with no supplies and armed men hunting them, was nearly impossible. Nearly. Silas was still working through plans when he heard it. The distant sound of hoofbeats, coming fast from the south. His grip tightened on the rifle as he scanned the trail below. 3 riders appeared, pushing their horses hard, scanning the ground for tracks. They found the creek bank, one of them shouted. Tracks lead north. How far could they have gotten on foot? Another called back. Not far enough. Spread out, check every hiding spot. Thornton wants them found before nightfall. The riders split up, 2 continuing north along the creek while the 3rd angled east toward the rocks where Silas and Eleanor were hidden. Silas's heart hammered as the man dismounted, leading his horse up the slope, eyes scanning the brush and stone. Behind him, Silas heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath. He gestured for silence, then slowly, carefully, raised his rifle. He didn't want to shoot. Gunfire would bring the others running, but if the man found them, he wouldn't have a choice. The rider was 20 feet away. 15, 10. Then his horse shied at something, a snake maybe, or just the rough terrain, and the man cursed, fighting to control the animal. After a tense moment, he remounted and angled back down the slope, rejoining the search farther along the creek. Silas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Eleanor's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. That had been too close. Way too close. We can't stay here, she whispered. They'll keep searching. They'll find us. I know. Silas checked the position of the sun. Still morning, hours of daylight left. Moving now was suicide, but staying was a guarantee of capture. We wait until they're farther north, then we move west. There's someone who might help us, but we need to make it to the Black Hills first. How far? Too far. He met her eyes. But it's our only shot. They waited another agonizing hour, listening to the searchers spread out across the landscape. The men were thorough, checking every possible hiding spot, but the terrain was vast and they were only 3 riders. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded to the north, giving Silas and Eleanor a window. Now, Silas said, stay low, move fast, and for God's sake, don't make noise. They emerged from the rocks and headed west, using every bit of cover the land offered, gullies, tree lines, rock formations. The going was rough, the terrain unforgiving, and Eleanor stumbled multiple times on the uneven ground. But she never complained, never asked to slow down. She just kept moving, driven by the same desperate need for survival that propelled Silas forward. By midday, they'd put maybe another 3 miles between themselves and the searchers. Not enough, never enough. But it was something. They stopped briefly at a creek to drink and catch their breath, Silas's eyes constantly scanning for threats. "Tell me about this person who might help us," Eleanor said between gasps. "Can we trust him?" Jacob Running Bear, Lakota, lost most of his family to the wars and relocations, but he kept his land through legal challenges and sheer stubbornness. Silas cupped water in his hands, drinking deeply. "He's a good man. Doesn't care much for the government or the law that failed his people. If anyone will shelter us, it's him." "And if he won't?" Silas didn't answer because they both knew what that meant. Without help, without horses and supplies, they'd die in the wilderness or be captured trying to survive. They pushed on as the sun climbed higher, the day growing warmer but still carrying the chill of early spring. Silas set a punishing pace, knowing their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. Men like Thornton didn't accept failure. They'd hunt Eleanor to the ends of the earth if necessary, not just for revenge but to silence the truth she represented. Late afternoon brought a new crisis. They'd been climbing a rocky ridge when Silas heard the sound again, hoofbeats, but this time from the west. His stomach dropped. They'd sent riders ahead to cut them off. "Eleanor, run!" He pushed her toward a cluster of boulders higher up the slope. "Hide, I'll draw them off." "No, I won't leave you. You have to." He grabbed her shoulders, his eyes fierce. "Listen to me. If they catch us both, everything we've done is for nothing. But if you get away, if you survive, you can still clear your name. You can still live." "I don't want to live without you," she said, and the raw honesty in her voice nearly broke him. "You might have to." He pressed his rifle into her hands. "Take this. If anyone other than me comes up that slope, you shoot first and ask questions never. Understand?" Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded, taking the rifle with trembling hands. Silas kissed her hard and fast, pouring everything he couldn't say into that single moment, then turned and ran down the slope, deliberately making noise, leaving an obvious trail. The riders spotted him within minutes. 3 men, well armed, spreading out to cut off his escape. Silas ran for a tree line, his lungs burning, legs aching from exhaustion and days without proper rest. Behind him, he heard shouting. "There! That's McCord! Where's the woman?" "Must have split up. Jenkins, circle around, make sure she's not—" Gunfire exploded across the ridge, and Silas felt something hot and sharp graze his left shoulder. Pain bloomed, immediate and intense, but he kept running, weaving between trees, using the terrain to his advantage. Another shot kicked up dirt near his feet, then another. These men weren't trying to capture him. They were trying to kill him, which meant Thornton had changed the plan. Maybe he'd decided Eleanor was more trouble than she was worth alive. Maybe he just wanted revenge for the inconvenience she'd caused. Either way, Silas was now a target, and he was unarmed except for the knife at his belt. He burst out of the tree line into a clearing and saw it. A rocky outcropping with a narrow gap, barely wide enough for a man but too small for horses. Silas dove for it as another bullet whined past his head, squeezing through the opening just as the riders reached the clearing. "He's in the rocks!" "Flush him out!" Silas pressed himself against the stone, breathing hard, his shoulder screaming. He touched it gingerly. The bullet had carved a furrow through the muscle, but hadn't lodged. Painful as hell, but not immediately life-threatening. He'd live, if he could figure out how to survive the next 10 minutes. The riders dismounted, approaching cautiously. Silas could hear their boots on stone, hear them coordinating their approach. He palmed his knife, knowing it was pathetically inadequate against 3 armed men, but refusing to die without a fight. Then, from somewhere above and behind the riders, a single rifle shot cracked across the clearing. One of the men dropped like a stone. Silas's heart stopped. Eleanor. That had to be Eleanor. She'd followed him, taken up a position, and just saved his life. The 2 remaining riders dove for cover, shouting in confusion and alarm. Another shot rang out, missing, but forcing the men to keep their heads down. Silas seized the opportunity. emerging from his hiding spot and sprinting toward where one of the riders had taken cover behind a fallen log. The man saw him coming too late. Silas crashed into him, knife flashing, and the struggle was brief and brutal. The man went limp, and Silas grabbed his pistol, spinning toward the last rider who was aiming up the slope toward Eleanor's position. "Hey!" Silas shouted. The man turned, and Silas fired twice. The second shot found its mark, and the rider fell back, his gun clattering away across the stone. Silence descended, broken only by Silas's ragged breathing and the ringing in his ears from the gunshots. He stood there, swaying, his wounded shoulder throbbing, staring at the bodies of 3 men who'd tried to kill them. "Silas!" He looked up to see Eleanor scrambling down the slope, the rifle still clutched in her hands, her face white with shock and fear. She reached him, and he caught her, both of them shaking, holding each other so tight it hurt. "I told you to hide," he managed. "I don't follow orders well." Her laugh was half sob. "You're hurt. Oh, God, you're bleeding." "It's not bad. Graze." He pulled back to look at her. "You shot that man. You saved my life." "I couldn't let them kill you." Her voice broke. "I couldn't, Silas. I can't do this without you." He kissed her forehead, then forced himself to focus. They didn't have time for the emotions crashing through him. "We need to move. The gunfire will bring others." But Eleanor was staring at the bodies, at what they'd done, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "I killed a man. I actually killed. Eleanor, look at me." Silas cupped her face, forcing her eyes to his. "You did what you had to do. He would have killed us both. You saved us. Do you hear me? You saved us." She nodded shakily, and he saw her gathering herself, pushing through the shock with that inner strength he'd come to admire so deeply. They took what they needed from the dead men: water, ammunition, some dried meat. Silas also took one of their horses, a sturdy bay gelding that seemed calmer than the others. It wasn't enough for both of them to ride comfortably, but it was better than continuing on foot. "Can you ride?" he asked Eleanor. "Yes, but you're injured." "I'll manage." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her, biting back a groan as the movement jarred his wounded shoulder. "Hold on tight. We ride hard until dark." They rode west as the sun began its descent, the black hills growing larger on the horizon. Behind them, Silas knew more riders would come. Thornton had sent 6 men, 3 were dead, but that left 3 more, plus however many others he might have hired. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. But as the horse carried them toward the mountains, as Eleanor leaned back against his chest and his good arm wrapped around her waist, Silas felt something unexpected blooming in the midst of the fear and pain. Hope. They'd survived. They'd fought back and won. And they were still together, still free, still moving toward whatever future they could carve out of this nightmare. The sun set as they entered the foothills, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Silas guided the horse into a narrow canyon, following half-remembered trails from years ago when he'd hunted these hills with Jacob. Somewhere up ahead, if his memory served, there was a cave where they could shelter for the night. They found it just as full darkness fell, a shallow depression in the cliff face, hidden behind a screen of pine trees, barely large enough for both of them and the horse. Silas dismounted carefully, every muscle screaming protest, and helped Eleanor down. "We'll rest here tonight," he said. "No fire, too risky, but we should be safe until morning." Eleanor was examining his shoulder by the last light of dusk, her fingers gentle but efficient. "You need proper medical attention. This could get infected." "I've had worse." He caught her hand, stopping her fussing. "Eleanor, we made it. Against all odds, we made it this far." She looked at him, and in the fading light he saw everything written on her face: fear, exhaustion, determination, and something else. Something that matched what he felt burning in his own chest. "I love you," she said simply. "I know it's insane. I know we barely know each other, but I love you, Silas McCord. You're the best man I've ever known. And if we die out here, I need you to know that." Silas pulled her close, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and kissed her like a drowning man finding air. When they broke apart, his voice was rough with emotion. "We're not going to die. I'm going to get you to safety, and then we're going to find a way to prove your innocence, and then—" He stopped, almost afraid to voice the hope taking root in his heart. And then we're going to have the life we both deserve, together. They settled into the shallow cave, Eleanor curled against his good side, both of them wrapped in the single blanket they'd taken from one of the dead men. The horse stood at the entrance, a silent guardian against the night. Silas stared up at the stars visible through the cave mouth and thought about the impossible journey that had brought them here. A lonely rancher who'd answered a mail-order bride advertisement in a moment of weakness. A desperate woman fleeing false accusations and powerful enemies. A rushed marriage meant to provide legal protection. And somehow, impossibly, a love that had grown fierce and true in the space of mere weeks. "Tell me about Jacob Running Bear," Eleanor murmured against his chest. "Tell me we're going to make it to him." So Silas talked quietly into the darkness, describing the man who'd taught him to track, who'd shared stories of his people's history, who'd looked at the world with eyes that had seen too much suffering but still held wisdom and kindness. He talked until Eleanor's breathing evened out and she fell into exhausted sleep. Then he kept watch through the long night, his pistol in one hand and the other resting protectively over Eleanor's heart, feeling it beat strong and steady against his palm. They'd survived this long. They'd keep surviving. They had to, because somewhere out in the darkness, their enemies were still hunting. And come morning, the chase would begin again. Dawn broke cold and gray, the kind of morning that promised nothing good. Silas woke to pain radiating from his shoulder and Eleanor's soft breathing against his chest. For just a moment, before full consciousness returned, he let himself pretend they were back at the ranch, safe in their own bed, with nothing more pressing than morning chores ahead of them. Then reality crashed in, and he remembered. The gunfight, the bodies they'd left behind, the relentless pursuit that wouldn't end until Eleanor was captured or they were both dead. He eased himself up carefully, trying not to wake her, but her eyes flew open immediately. She'd been sleeping the way hunted animals slept, lightly, ready to run at the first sign of danger. "Morning," he said softly. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I should have." She sat up, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, and studied his face with concern. "Your shoulder?" "Still attached." He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. The wound had stiffened overnight, and his whole left side felt like it was on fire. "We should get moving, put more distance between us and whoever's following." They shared the last of the dried meat and water, a meager breakfast that did little to quiet their hunger, but at least gave them energy to continue. Silas checked the horse. The gelding had weathered the night well enough, and surveyed the terrain ahead. The Black Hills rose in earnest now, pine-covered slopes climbing toward rocky peaks shrouded in morning mist. Somewhere in those hills, Jacob Running Bear maintained his small homestead. The question was whether Silas could find it after all these years, and whether Jacob would risk harboring fugitives when he himself lived at the mercy of a government that had already taken so much from his people. "How much farther?" Eleanor asked, reading his thoughts as she'd become uncannily good at doing. "Half a day's ride, maybe less if my memory's right." He helped her onto the horse, then mounted behind her, gritting his teeth against the pain. "There's a valley, with a stream running through it, cottonwoods growing along the banks. Jacob's cabin is there, built into the hillside so you barely see it until you're right on top of it." They rode into the foothills as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill. The terrain grew rougher, forcing them to pick their way carefully between trees and over rocky ground. Several times Silas thought he heard sounds of pursuit, hoofbeats, voices carried on the wind, but each time it turned out to be nothing. His nerves were stretched to breaking, every shadow a potential threat, every bird's startled flight a sign that enemies were close. Eleanor sat stiff and alert in front of him, her hand resting on the pistol at her hip. She'd changed so much from the elegant woman who'd stepped off that train less than a month ago, that Eleanor had been beautiful but uncertain, refined but afraid. This Eleanor was harder, tempered by violence and fear, into something fierce and unbreakable. "I keep thinking about those men," she said quietly. "The ones we killed." "Don't." Silas's voice was firm. "They made their choice when they took Thornton's money, when they decided your life was worth less than their pay." "I know, but knowing doesn't make it easier to live with." He understood. he'd killed before. In defense of his family's homestead, protecting livestock from raiders, surviving the brutal realities of frontier life. But it never got easier. Taking a life, even in self-defense, left marks on your soul that never fully healed. We do what we have to do to survive, he said, and we live with the consequences. Together. She leaned back against him, careful of his wounded shoulder, and they rode in silence for a while. The forest grew denser, the shadows deeper, and Silas found himself navigating more by instinct than memory. It had been 3 years since he'd last visited Jacob. What if the man had moved? What if he'd died, or been forced off his land like so many others? What if they were riding toward nothing but false hope? By midday, they reached a high ridge that offered a view of the valley below. Silas reined in the horse, scanning the landscape, and felt relief surge through him when he spotted the glint of water through the trees. The stream. And there, barely visible among the cottonwoods, a tendril of smoke rising from what might have been a chimney. There, he said, pointing. That's where we're headed. They descended carefully, the horse picking its way down a steep trail that showed signs of occasional use. As they drew closer to the stream, Silas saw more evidence of habitation. A small garden plot, a lean-to shelter for animals, a stack of firewood covered with canvas, and then, tucked against the hillside exactly as he remembered, the cabin. It was small and sturdy, built from logs and stone, with a sod roof that made it blend almost invisibly into the landscape. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a few chickens scratched in the yard, and standing in the doorway, a rifle held loosely in weathered hands, was Jacob Running Bear. He was older than Silas remembered, his long black hair now streaked with silver, his face more deeply lined. But his eyes were the same, dark and intelligent, missing nothing. Those eyes took in Silas and Eleanor, the exhausted horse, the crude bandage on Silas's shoulder, and the fear written across both their faces. "Silas McCord," Jacob said in his measured voice. "Been a long time." "Too long." Silas dismounted carefully, then helped Eleanor down. "Jacob, I need your help. We need your help." Jacob's gaze moved to Eleanor, studying her with the same careful assessment. "This the mail-order bride I heard about? The one half the territory's looking for?" So word had spread even this far. Silas wasn't surprised, but it didn't make things easier. "Her name's Eleanor. She's my wife, and she's innocent of what they're accusing her of." "I didn't ask if she was innocent." Jacob lowered the rifle slightly. "I asked if she's the one they're looking for." "Yes." For a long moment, Jacob said nothing. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside. Both of you. That horse needs water and rest, and you look like you need doctoring." Silas felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. "Thank you, Jacob." "Don't thank me yet. We need to talk about what you're asking me to do." But despite the stern words, Jacob's expression was kind as he looked at Eleanor. "You're safe here for now. Come." The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A main room with a hearth, a sleeping area curtained off with blankets, shelves lined with supplies and tools. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a pleasant, earthy scent. Jacob gestured to a rough-hewn table and chairs. "Sit. I'll make tea." While Jacob worked at the hearth, Silas helped Eleanor into a chair. She looked ready to collapse, the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright for 2 days finally wearing off. He wanted to gather her close, promise her everything would be all right, but he couldn't make promises he might not be able to keep. Jacob brought cups of steaming tea, something herbal and bitter, but warming. He sat across from them, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. "Tell me what happened. All of it." So they did. Eleanor spoke first, her voice steady as she recounted the story she'd told Silas, Richard Caulfield's obsessive pursuit, the confrontation in his office, his death, and her desperate flight west. Then Silas took over, describing their marriage, the marshal's visit, Thornton's threats, and their flight from the ranch. "We killed 3 of Thornton's men yesterday," Silas finished quietly. "Self-defense, but that won't matter if we're caught. They'll hang us both." Jacob listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he sat silent for a long moment, staring into his tea. "You're asking me to harbor fugitives from federal law." he said finally. You know what that means for me? For my people. We're already watched, already suspected. One mistake, and they'll use it as an excuse to take this land too. I know. Silas met his old friend's eyes. And if you say no, we'll leave. No hard feelings. I won't put you at risk, Jacob, but I had nowhere else to go. Why not Canada? Keep running north? We're on foot except for one stolen horse. No supplies. I'm wounded. We wouldn't make it a week. Silas's voice roughened. I need help, Jacob. Just a few days to rest and plan. Then we'll disappear and you'll never have to worry about us again. Jacob looked at Eleanor again, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. Your husband killed the man who tried to force himself on you. That's what you're saying? No, Eleanor said firmly. I killed him. It was my hand on the letter opener, my decision to fight back. Silas is risking everything to protect me from the consequences of that choice. And you love him? The question was direct, almost blunt. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Yes, more than I knew I could love anyone. Jacob nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He turned to Silas. And you? You love this woman enough to throw away your life, your ranch, everything you built? Yes. Silas reached for Eleanor's hand, their fingers interlacing. She's worth more than all of it combined. Another long silence. Then Jacob stood, moving to a chest in the corner. When he returned, he was holding bundles of dried herbs and clean cloth bandages. Let me see that shoulder. Can't have you dying of infection before we figure out what to do with you. Relief crashed over Silas so intensely he felt dizzy. Jacob, Save it. But Jacob's stern expression was undermined by the hint of warmth in his eyes. You helped me once when raiders were killing my livestock. Said you didn't care what the government thought. That right was right. Guess I owe you the same courtesy. As Jacob cleaned and dressed Silas's wound with practiced efficiency, Eleanor watched with gratitude shining in her eyes. The older man worked in silence, his touch gentle despite his rough appearance. This'll need watching, he said finally, tying off the bandage. Change the dressing twice a day. Keep it clean. You're lucky. The bullet missed anything vital. But you push yourself too hard. It'll tear open, and then you'll have real problems. I'll make sure he rests, Eleanor said. Jacob smiled slightly. I believe you will. He stood, gathering the soiled bandages. Now, let's talk about what comes next. Because you can't stay here indefinitely, and running blind will just get you killed. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Jacob had traveled to Red River Junction 2 weeks prior and heard the gossip about the beautiful mail-order bride, about the marshal's questions, about Thornton's arrival with his hired guns. He'd even seen the wanted poster, though he hadn't connected it to Silas until now. Thornton's offering a substantial reward, Jacob said. $1,000 for Eleanor's capture, dead or alive. That's going to motivate every bounty hunter and desperate man within 300 miles. $1,000? Eleanor's face went white. That's more than most people see in a year. It's blood money, Silas said grimly. Thornton wants you dead, Eleanor. The trial was always just for show. He's afraid of what you might reveal about Caulfield's business dealings. Jacob nodded. That's my read too. Which means running isn't enough. You need to change the game entirely. How? Eleanor asked. We have no evidence, no witnesses, no... You have the truth, Jacob interrupted. And sometimes the truth has a way of coming out if you're patient enough. He looked at Silas. You said you wrote to her sister, asking for evidence? Yes, weeks ago. But even if Catherine found something, even if she sent proof, the letter would go to the ranch. And the ranch is probably being watched. So we get someone to retrieve it. Jacob's eyes gleamed with the first hint of a plan. Someone they're not watching. Someone who has legitimate business at your place. Who? Me. Jacob leaned back in his chair. I trade with the ranchers sometimes. Meat, hides, herbs for medicine. Nobody thinks twice about me traveling through the territory. I could ride to your ranch, check if any mail arrived, retrieve it without raising suspicion. Hope flickered in Silas's chest. That could work? But Jacob, it's risky. Everything's risky right now. Question is whether we take smart risks or stupid ones. He looked between them. If there's evidence that proves Eleanor's innocence, that changes everything. Even Thornton's money can't completely corrupt the system if the truth is undeniable enough. And if there's no letter? Eleanor's voice was small. If Catherine couldn't find anything, then we figure out another plan. But we don't give up. Jacob's expression was fierce. I've seen enough innocent people destroyed by powerful men. I won't stand by and watch it happen again. Not if there's something I can do to stop it. That night, they made their plans concrete. Jacob would leave at first light, taking 2 days to reach Silas's ranch. He'd approach openly, as he would for any normal trading visit. If anyone questioned him, he'd say he'd heard Silas had gone away for a while and wanted to check on the place. He'd retrieve any mail, then return along a different route to avoid leading anyone back to his cabin. "You'll stay here while I'm gone," Jacob said. "There's food enough for several weeks if you ration carefully. Keep the fire low during the day, and don't go outside more than necessary. The cabin's hidden well, but only if you're careful." "We'll be careful," Eleanor promised. After Jacob retired to his sleeping area, Silas and Eleanor sat by the fire, speaking in low voices. Silas's shoulder ached despite Jacob's herbs, but having Eleanor curled against his good side made it bearable. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked. "Do you think Catherine found something?" "I don't know." He kissed the top of her head. "But I know we have to try. We can't run forever, Eleanor. Eventually we'd make a mistake, or our luck would run out. This might be our only chance at a real future." "I'm scared." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Not just of being caught. I'm scared that even if we prove my innocence, we'll have lost everything. Your ranch is gone. We're fugitives. How do we come back from this?" Silas thought about the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the land he'd worked for 6 years, the life he'd carved out of wilderness and grief. He thought about everything he'd lost when his family died, and everything he'd found when Eleanor stepped off that train. "We start over," he said simply. "Somewhere new. Build something different. As long as we're together, the rest is just details." She looked up at him, her green eyes bright with tears. "How can you be so sure? How can you have so much faith when everything's falling apart?" "Because of you." He cupped her face gently. "Because you taught me that hope isn't foolish. It's necessary. Because you're the bravest person I've ever known. And if you can keep fighting, so can I." She kissed him then, deep and desperate, and Silas felt the weight of everything they'd endured and everything still ahead pressing down on them. But beneath that weight was something stronger, love, real and fierce and unshakable. They spent the night wrapped in each other's arms, taking comfort where they could find it, storing up strength for whatever battles lay ahead. Jacob left at dawn, riding a sturdy paint horse and carrying trade goods to maintain his cover story. He gripped Silas's good shoulder before mounting. "I'll be back in 4 days, maybe 5. Keep your heads down and your guns close." "Jacob." Silas's voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you for everything. Save your thanks until this is over." But Jacob's stern expression softened. "Take care of your wife, Silas. She's a good woman, worth fighting for." They watched him ride away until he disappeared into the trees, then retreated to the cabin. The next days passed in a strange limbo, waiting, worrying, trying to maintain hope while fear gnawed at their resolve. Eleanor proved skilled at making much out of little, stretching Jacob's supplies into decent meals. Silas rested as ordered, letting his shoulder heal, though inactivity made him restless and irritable. They talked for hours, learning each other's histories in depth. Eleanor described her childhood in Boston, the expectations, the restrictions, the suffocating weight of society's demands on young women. Silas shared memories of his family, stories he'd locked away for years now flowing freely. They laughed at small things, held each other through dark moments, and fell more deeply in love with each passing day. On the third night, Silas woke suddenly to find Eleanor missing from their makeshift bed. Panic seized him until he spotted her standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the night sky. "Eleanor?" She turned, her face streaked with tears. "I was just looking at the stars, thinking about Catherine, praying she's safe." He joined her at the door, wrapping an arm around her waist. "She is. Your sister sounds like a strong woman. Thornton won't risk going after her without cause. It would draw too much attention. I hope you're right. She leaned against him. I keep thinking about what happens if Jacob doesn't find a letter. If we have to run again, keep running forever. I'm tired, Silas. I'm so tired of being afraid. I know, sweetheart, I know. They stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other's presence, while somewhere in the distance a wolf howled its loneliness to the moon. Jacob returned on the 5th day, riding hard, his face grim. Silas's heart sank when he saw the expression. Did you find anything? Jacob dismounted, pulling a bundle from his saddlebag. Not just one letter, several tied together with string. Your ranch is being watched, but not closely. I went in during early morning, checked your mail cache. These were waiting. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the bundle. The top letter was addressed in feminine handwriting to Mr. and Mrs. Silas McCord. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and began to read aloud. Dear Eleanor, I pray this reaches you safely. I've been searching as you asked, and what I found... Her voice broke. What I found will change everything. The letter detailed months of investigation by Catherine and several friends who believed in Eleanor's innocence. They'd interviewed Caulfield's servants, who testified to his violent temper and his obsessive pursuit of Eleanor. They'd found business associates who'd witnessed his threats. Most damning of all, they'd located Caulfield's private journals, which detailed not just his intentions toward Eleanor, but illegal business dealings that implicated several prominent Boston figures, including Judge Morrison, who'd signed Eleanor's arrest warrant. The journals are with a lawyer now, Eleanor read, her voice strengthening. Mr. Samuel Whitmore, a good man, honest, who's agreed to bring them to federal authorities. He says with this evidence, the charges against you will be dropped. Eleanor, you can come home. You can finally come home. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. Catherine did it. She actually did it. Silas felt something like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. There's a lawyer? Working on your case? Jacob pulled out another letter, this one bearing an official seal. This came, too, from the federal prosecutor's office in Boston. Silas read it quickly, his heart pounding. It was a formal notice that new evidence had come to light in the Eleanor Hartwell case. An investigation was being opened into potential corruption. All arrest warrants were temporarily suspended pending review. Temporarily suspended, Eleanor repeated. That's not the same as cleared. No, but it's a start. Silas pulled her close, mindful of his healing shoulder. It means we have a chance, a real chance at proving your innocence. There's more, Jacob said quietly. He handed over a newspaper, several weeks old from Boston. The headline made them all freeze. Prominent banker's death ruled accident. Questions raised about prior murder charges. The article detailed how new evidence suggested Richard Caulfield's death had been the result of a confrontation he'd initiated. Several witnesses had come forward. The judge who'd signed the arrest warrant had been implicated in covering up Caulfield's illegal activities and was under investigation himself. The tide is turning, Jacob observed. Slowly, but turning. Eleanor was crying openly now, her whole body shaking with relief and residual fear. Does this mean it's over? Can we stop running? Not yet, Silas cautioned, though hope was surging through him. Thornton's still out there, and the warrant's only temporarily suspended, not dismissed. But Eleanor, this means we have allies, people fighting for you back east. The truth is coming out. So what do we do now? She looked between Silas and Jacob. We can't go back to Boston while the investigation is ongoing, but we can't stay fugitives either. Jacob sat down heavily. You need to contact this lawyer directly. Work with him to arrange your return under protected circumstances. But that'll take time. Weeks at least. Maybe months. We have time, Silas said. We'll wait here as long as Jacob will have us. Let the investigation play out. Let the truth do its work. He looked at Eleanor, his voice firm with conviction. We've survived this long. We can survive a little longer. That night, Eleanor wrote a careful response to Catherine and another to the lawyer, Samuel Whitmore. Jacob promised to post them from the next town, maintaining operational security. The letters detailed their location and situation, requesting guidance on how to proceed safely. This could take months to resolve, Eleanor said as she sealed the letters. The legal process, the investigation. What if Thornton finds us before then? What if... Then we deal with it. Silas pulled her into his arms. Together, like we've dealt with everything else. But privately, he shared her concerns. Thornton had already proven he was willing to kill to silence Eleanor. A federal investigation might only make him more desperate, more dangerous. Which is exactly what happened. 3 nights later, Eleanor woke to the sound of horses approaching fast. She shook Silas awake, her hand already reaching for the pistol. Riders! Multiple! They were dressed and armed within seconds, Jacob already at the window with his rifle. Through the darkness, they could see torches approaching, at least 8 riders, moving with purpose toward the cabin. They found us, Eleanor whispered. Silas's mind raced. 8 men against 3 defenders, one of them wounded, in a cabin with limited escape routes. The odds were terrible, but they'd faced terrible odds before and survived. Jacob, the back way out, is it still there? Yes. Through the root cellar comes out in the tree line about 50 yards north. Jacob was already moving, pulling up floorboards to reveal a narrow tunnel. Go, now, I'll hold them here. We're not leaving you, Silas protested. You don't have a choice. They want Eleanor, not me. I'll tell them you left days ago, send them on a false trail. Jacob's expression was fierce. This is my land, my home. I know every inch of these hills. I can disappear after they leave, but you two can't fight your way out. So you run. Eleanor was already gathering their few belongings. Silas gripped Jacob's shoulder. We'll come back for you. When this is over, just live, Jacob interrupted. Live and be happy. That's all the thanks I need. The riders were close now, their shouts audible. Silas and Eleanor descended into the tunnel, crawling through darkness and earth. Behind them, they heard Jacob calling out. Who's there? State your business. The response was gunfire. Eleanor gasped, but Silas pulled her forward. Keep moving. He knew what he was doing. He's giving us a chance. We can't waste it. They emerged in the tree line just as more gunshots erupted from the cabin. Silas's heart clenched, but he forced himself to focus. Jacob had bought them time. They had to use it. They ran through the forest, branches whipping their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, the sounds of violence continued, then stopped abruptly. Silas didn't let himself think about what that silence might mean. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, finally collapsing in a rocky outcrop miles from Jacob's cabin. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene given what they'd just fled. Jacob, Eleanor sobbed. We left him. We just left him. He made us leave. He gave us a gift, Eleanor. We honor it by surviving. But Silas's voice was raw with grief and guilt. Another person had sacrificed for them, another debt they could never repay. They had no supplies, no horses, nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weapons they carried. But they had the letters. Eleanor's proof of innocence carefully tucked in her coat pocket. And they had each other. What now? Eleanor asked, wiping her tears. Silas looked at the rising sun, then north toward Canada and west toward California, and back east toward a justice system that might finally be on their side. Now, he said, taking her hand, we finish this, one way or another. They spent 2 days moving through the wilderness like ghosts, surviving on creek water and what little they could forage. Silas's shoulder had torn open again during their flight, blood seeping through the bandage, but he refused to slow down. Every minute they stayed in one place was a minute Thornton's men could catch up to them. On the 3rd morning, weak from hunger and exhaustion, they stumbled onto a narrow trail that showed signs of regular use. Silas studied the ground, reading the tracks with skills Jacob had taught him years ago. Freight wagon, he said quietly. Passed through yesterday, heading east, probably making supply runs between settlements. Eleanor looked at him with hollow eyes. East? Toward Red River Junction? Maybe. Or one of the smaller towns. He helped her sit on a fallen log, concerned by how pale she'd become. They couldn't keep running like this. Without food, without shelter, they'd die in these hills long before Thornton found them. We need to take a chance, he said finally. Follow this trail, find the next settlement, get help. Silas, everyone's looking for us. If we show our faces, then we'll be careful. But Eleanor, we're dying out here. He knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands. I'd rather take a calculated risk than watch you slowly starve. She studied his face, seeing the determination there, and finally nodded. Together. Whatever happens. Together. They followed the trail east for hours, Silas keeping them just inside the tree line where they could duck for cover if necessary. The sun was past its peak when they spotted buildings in the distance, a small settlement, maybe a dozen structures clustered around what looked like a mining operation. I'll go in first, Silas said. Scout it out. See if it's safe. No. Eleanor's grip on his arm was fierce. We stay together. I'm not losing you now, not when we're so close to the end of this. Close to the end. Silas hoped she was right, hoped the letters tucked in her coat pocket would be enough to save them. But hope was a fragile thing when men with guns and unlimited resources were hunting you. They approached the settlement cautiously, trying to look like weary travelers rather than desperate fugitives. The town, if it could be called that, consisted of a general store, a boarding house, a saloon, and several rough cabins. Men moved between the buildings, miners mostly, with the hard look of people who'd come west seeking fortune and found only backbreaking labor. No one paid them much attention as they entered the general store, a cramped building smelling of tobacco and leather. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked them over. Help you folks? Need supplies, Silas said, keeping his voice level despite his racing heart. Food, water, bandages if you have them. The man's eyes lingered on Silas's blood-stained shoulder, then moved to Eleanor's face. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, maybe? Or just curiosity about why a refined woman was traveling with an injured man through rough country. That'll be $3. It was highway robbery for basic supplies, but Silas didn't have the energy to argue. He counted out coins from their dwindling funds while the proprietor assembled their order with deliberate slowness, his eyes constantly returning to Eleanor. Seen any law come through here recently? Silas asked casually as the man wrapped their purchases. Marshall passed through 2 days ago, had deputies with him asking questions. The proprietor's gaze was sharp. Looking for a woman wanted for murder back east, said she was traveling with a rancher, both of them armed and dangerous. Silas felt Eleanor stiffen beside him, but kept his own expression neutral. That's so. They have any luck? Not that I heard. The man pushed the bundle across the counter, but they left a wanted poster, offering a substantial reward. He pulled a paper from beneath the counter, and Silas's stomach dropped. There was Eleanor's face, rendered in careful detail, with wanted for murder printed in bold letters across the top. Below it, a second sketch, himself, less accurate but recognizable enough. You see anyone matching these descriptions? Silas said carefully. You let me know. Could use that reward money. The proprietor studied them both for a long, tense moment. Then he folded the poster and tucked it away. I'll keep my eyes open. You folks staying in town? Just passing through. Silas gathered their supplies, his hand close to his pistol. Much obliged. They left the store moving casually, trying not to run despite every instinct screaming at them to flee. But they'd only made it halfway to the settlement's edge when a voice called out behind them. Mr. McCord! Mrs. McCord! Please wait! They turned slowly to find a young woman hurrying toward them, maybe 20 years old, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. She glanced around nervously before speaking in a low, urgent voice. I know who you are. I saw the poster, but I also heard what really happened. My cousin works for the federal prosecutor in Boston. She wrote me about your case. Eleanor's eyes widened. Your cousin works with Mr. Whitmore, the lawyer handling your case. She said you were innocent, said powerful men were trying to bury the truth. The woman pressed a folded paper into Eleanor's hands. This came for you through the postal service 3 days ago. The storekeeper was supposed to forward it to Red River Junction, but when I saw your names, I kept it. Hoped you might come through. Eleanor unfolded the paper with shaking hands. It was a telegram from Samuel Whitmore, brief but earth-shattering. Charges dismissed. Stop. Judge Morrison arrested. Stop. Caulfield's journals prove conspiracy. Stop. Return to Boston immediately. Stop. Full pardon awaits. Stop. Silas read it over her shoulder, hardly daring to believe the words. Charges dismissed. Eleanor, it's over. You're free. Not yet. She's not. The young woman's expression was troubled. There are men in town, arrived yesterday, asking questions. They're not law, more like hired guns. One of them matches the description of Marcus Thornton. The relief that had been flooding through Silas turned to ice. How many men? 6 that I counted. They're staying at the boarding house, but they've been watching the roads. I think they're waiting for you. Of course they were. Even with the charges dismissed, Thornton wouldn't let Eleanor go free. She knew too much about Caulfield's illegal dealings, could testify against everyone involved. As long as she lived, she was a threat to powerful men who'd built fortunes on corruption. There's a back way out of town, the woman continued, through the mining tunnels. Comes out about 2 miles north. I can show you, but we need to go now, before... Before what? A cold voice interrupted from behind them. They spun to find Marcus Thornton standing 20 feet away, flanked by 4 armed men. Silas recognized 2 of them from the attack on Jacob's cabin. His hand moved toward his pistol, but Thornton raised a warning finger. I wouldn't. My men have rifles trained on you from 3 different positions. You'd be dead before your gun cleared leather. Silas's eyes darted around, spotting the glint of metal from a second-story window, another from the alley beside the store. Thornton had planned this carefully, positioned his men for maximum advantage. They were trapped. The charges are dismissed, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the fear Silas could feel radiating from her. There's a telegram. My innocence has been proven. Whatever you think you're accomplishing... Oh, I know about the telegram. Thornton's smile was cold. I also know you have Richard's journals. Or rather, your sister does. Evidence that could destroy a dozen prominent men, myself included. You really think we'd let you live long enough to testify? You'd murder her in broad daylight? In front of witnesses? The young woman stepped forward bravely. That's insane. Not murder. Self-defense. Thornton's eyes never left Eleanor. See, Mrs. McCord is a known fugitive who resisted arrest and drew a weapon. Tragic that we had to shoot her. Even more tragic that her husband died trying to protect her. But these things happen on the frontier. Silas's mind raced, calculating odds and finding them all terrible. 6 men, all armed and positioned strategically. Even if he and Eleanor managed to draw their weapons, they'd be cut down in seconds. But surrendering meant death just as surely. Thornton would kill them the moment they were isolated from witnesses, which meant their only chance was to change the game entirely. You're right, Silas said loudly, making sure his voice carried to the miners who'd stopped to watch the confrontation. We did resist arrest, because the law back east was corrupt, because a powerful banker tried to force himself on my wife, and when she defended herself, his friends framed her for murder. Shut your mouth, Thornton snarled. But Silas kept talking, directing his words to the growing crowd of onlookers. Richard Caulfield was a criminal. He and his associates, including Judge Morrison, who was arrested 3 days ago, they built their fortunes on illegal deals and violence. My wife has evidence of all of it. That's why these men want her dead. Not justice. Silence. You're making this worse for yourself, Thornton warned. Am I? Because it seems to me you've got a problem. Silas gestured to the crowd of miners, laborers, and townspeople now watching intently. You shoot us now in front of all these witnesses, and you prove everything I'm saying is true. You let us go, and we testify against you and your friends. Either way, you lose. Thornton's expression darkened with rage. These people don't care about Boston politics or dead bankers. They care about a $1,000 reward. Actually, a gruff voice called from the crowd, we care about right and wrong. An older miner stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. I read about that case in the newspapers. Rich man's death, poor woman blamed. Seemed wrong then, seems wrong now. Me too, another voice added. A shopkeeper this time. My daughter was harassed by a powerful man back in Ohio. Nobody believed her either. Nobody cared. More voices joined in, a growing chorus of support. These were people who'd fled east seeking new lives, who'd seen corruption and injustice firsthand. They recognized the story Silas was telling because they'd lived their own versions of it. Thornton looked around, realizing with visible shock that the crowd wasn't on his side. His hand moved toward his pistol, but the older miner was faster, his own weapon appearing with practiced ease. I don't think so, mister. You boys been throwing your weight around since you got here, acting like you own the place. Well, you don't. This is our town, and we don't take kindly to murderers. We're federal law enforcement, Thornton tried. Then show us your badges. Show us your warrants. The miner's voice was hard. Or admit you're just hired killers chasing an innocent woman. The standoff stretched, tension coiling tighter with each passing second. Thornton's men looked uncertain, outnumbered now by armed miners and townspeople who'd had enough of being pushed around by Eastern money and power. Finally, Thornton lowered his hand, but his eyes, when they met Eleanor's, promised death. This isn't over. Yes, Eleanor said quietly. It is. She pulled the telegram from her pocket and held it up for everyone to see. The charges against me have been dismissed. Judge Morrison, who signed my arrest warrant, has been arrested for corruption. Richard Caulfield's own journals prove he was a criminal who died while attacking me. The truth has come out, Mr. Thornton, and no amount of money or hired guns can bury it again. For a moment, Silas thought Thornton might try something desperate, but the man was calculating enough to know when he'd lost. He gestured sharply to his men, and they began backing away, keeping their weapons ready but not drawing them. You think you've won, Thornton said. But there are always more powerful men, always more ways to make problems disappear. Maybe, Silas replied. But today, right now, we're walking out of here alive, and tomorrow we'll wake up free. That's winning enough for me. Thornton and his men mounted their horses and rode out of town, leaving threats hanging in the air but no bodies on the ground. The crowd of townspeople remained, watching until the riders disappeared, then broke into spontaneous applause. The older miner approached Silas and Eleanor with a gap-toothed grin. You folks need somewhere safe to stay until you can arrange travel back east. My wife runs the boarding house. No charge for people standing up to bastards like that. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. Thank you so much. That night, safe for the first time in weeks, Silas and Eleanor lay together in a real bed with clean sheets and a locked door between them and the world. Silas's shoulder had been properly treated by the town's doctor, an elderly woman who'd clucked over his injuries and declared him lucky to still have full use of his arm. Is it really over? Eleanor whispered into the darkness. Can we really go home? Not home, Silas corrected gently. My ranch is gone. Thornton probably burned it to the ground. And Boston was never really home for you, was it? No. She curled closer to him. Home was that little cabin in Wyoming. Home was you. Then we'll build a new home. Somewhere fresh. Somewhere they'll never find us. He stroked her hair, marveling that they'd survived. That against all odds they were still together. The lawyer's telegram said there's a pardon waiting. Once that's official, once you've given your testimony, we can go anywhere. Do anything. What do you want to do? She asked. If we could have anything, Silas thought about it. He'd lost his ranch, his livestock, 6 years of hard work. But he'd gained something infinitely more precious. Love. Real and fierce and tested by fire. He'd learned that home wasn't a place but a person. That hope was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let someone else see your scars. I want a small piece of land, he said finally. Nothing fancy. A cabin big enough for 2 people who love each other. Maybe a few horses. A garden. Space to breathe and be ourselves without looking over our shoulders. He paused. And eventually, if you want, maybe a family. Kids to fill that cabin with laughter. Eleanor's breath hitched. You'd want that? With me? Eleanor, I'd want everything with you. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. She kissed him then, soft and deep, and Silas tasted salt from her tears and sweetness from her lips. When they broke apart, both were smiling through their emotions. Where should we go? She asked. After Boston? After everything's settled? I've heard Oregon Territory is beautiful. Green valleys, mild winters, land available for homesteading. Far enough from Boston that the old scandals won't follow us. He grinned. Besides, they say the fishing's excellent. Maybe I'll teach our kids to fish in clear streams instead of muddy creeks. Our kids, Eleanor repeated, testing the words. I like the sound of that. They lay together in comfortable silence, making plans for a future that had seemed impossible just days ago. Tomorrow they'd send telegrams, arrange travel, begin the long process of clearing Eleanor's name officially. But tonight, they were just two people who'd found each other against all odds and refused to let the world tear them apart. The journey back to Boston took 3 weeks. They traveled carefully, using false names until Eleanor's pardon was official, but the fear that had dogged them for so long gradually loosened its grip. News traveled faster than they did. Word of Judge Morrison's arrest, of the conspiracy uncovered, of Richard Caulfield's true nature revealed through his own damning journals. By the time they reached Boston, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Eleanor wasn't a murderer anymore. She was a victim who'd fought back, a symbol of resistance against powerful men who thought they were above consequences. Samuel Whitmore met them at the station, a distinguished man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "Mrs. McCord. Mr. McCord. I'm so glad you made it safely." "Thanks to you," Eleanor said. "Mr. Whitmore, I can never repay what you've done. Seeing justice served is payment enough." He led them to a waiting carriage. "We have a lot of work ahead. Depositions, official testimony, finalizing the pardon. But the outcome isn't in doubt. You're free, Mrs. McCord. Truly and completely free." Catherine was waiting at Whitmore's office, and when Eleanor saw her sister, she broke down completely. They held each other and cried while Silas stood back, giving them privacy for their reunion. Catherine was younger than Eleanor, with the same auburn hair and green eyes, but her expression held a fierceness that reminded Silas of his wife. "I knew you didn't kill him," Catherine said, pulling back to look at Eleanor. "I knew it, and I wasn't going to let them destroy you for defending yourself. You saved my life. You and Mr. Whitmore." "No," Catherine said firmly. "You saved yourself. I just made sure the truth came out." She looked at Silas, assessing him with sharp eyes. "So you're the rancher who threw away everything to protect my sister?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. She deserves someone willing to fight for her." Catherine's expression softened. "Thank you for keeping her safe, for believing her when no one else would." The legal proceedings took another month. Eleanor gave testimony that helped bring down not just Caulfield's immediate associates, but an entire network of corruption that had infected Boston's banking and legal system. 12 men were indicted. Judge Morrison received a 10-year sentence. Marcus Thornton disappeared, probably fleeing to Europe with what remained of his fortune. And Eleanor's pardon was signed by the governor himself, with a formal apology for the injustice she'd suffered. They were leaving Boston a week later, their bags packed for the journey west, when a messenger arrived at their hotel with a letter. Silas opened it and felt his heart stop. "It's from Frank Dawson," he said, his voice shaking. "My neighbor. Silas, your ranch. It wasn't burned. Thornton's men never touched it." Eleanor grabbed the letter, reading quickly. Frank had been checking on the property regularly, keeping it maintained, protecting it from looters. Everything was still there, waiting for them. "We could go back," she breathed. "Silas, we could go home." He thought about that cabin in the Wyoming hills, the land he'd worked with his own hands, the life they'd started building before everything fell apart. Then he thought about the shadows that would always linger there, the fear, the violence, the memories of running. "Or," he said slowly, "we could sell it. Use the money to start fresh somewhere new. Somewhere with no ghosts, no painful memories. Just us and whatever future we want to build." Eleanor studied his face, understanding what he was offering. A clean break, a new beginning, the chance to be more than survivors, to be truly happy. "Oregon?" she asked with a small smile. "Oregon," he confirmed. They made arrangements to sell the Wyoming ranch through Frank, who promised to send them the proceeds. The amount was enough to purchase good land in Oregon, build a comfortable home, and start a modest cattle operation. More than enough for two people who'd learned that all they really needed was each other. On their last day in Boston, Eleanor took Silas to visit her parents' graves. The Hartwells had died while Eleanor was in Wyoming, her father of heart failure, her mother of grief shortly after. Catherine said they'd never believed their daughter was a murderer, but the scandal and shame had broken them nonetheless. "I'm sorry I couldn't clear your name before they died," Silas said quietly as Eleanor laid flowers on the graves. "They knew the truth in their hearts. That's what matters." She straightened, taking his hand. "And I have Catherine still. We've promised to write every week, and she'll visit once we're settled." They left Boston on a clear autumn morning, the city's spires fading behind them as their train carried them west. This time, Eleanor wasn't running. She was choosing. Choosing a new life, a new home, a future built on love instead of desperation. The journey took 2 weeks, and when they finally reached Oregon territory, Silas understood why people spoke of it with such reverence. The valleys were impossibly green, fed by rivers so clear you could see every stone on the bottom. Forests of pine and fir climbed into mountains that seemed to touch the clouds. The air itself felt different, clean and fresh and full of possibility. They found their land in a valley 20 miles from the nearest town, a small settlement called Willow Creek. 160 acres bordered by a river on one side and forest on the other, with a natural meadow perfect for grazing. The price was fair, the paperwork simple, and within a month they owned it outright. Building their cabin took the rest of autumn and into winter, but this time Silas wasn't building alone. Eleanor worked beside him, learning to handle tools, to measure and cut and fit boards together. They made mistakes and laughed about them, worked until their muscles ached and their hands blistered, and slowly watched their home take shape. It was smaller than the Wyoming cabin, more intimate. One main room with a fireplace, a sleeping loft above, a covered porch facing east toward the sunrise. Simple and honest and theirs. On Christmas Eve, they stood together on that porch, watching snow fall softly over their valley. Eleanor's hand rested on her stomach, which had just begun to show the first signs of the life growing within her. "We should talk about names," she said softly. Silas wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I was thinking Jacob, if it's a boy, and Rebecca if it's a girl." She turned in his arms, tears shining in her eyes. "Perfect. They'd both be honored." "We honor them by living," Silas said, "by being happy, by building something beautiful out of everything we survived." Over the next year, their ranch became a home. They acquired horses, good breeding stock that would eventually provide income. Eleanor planted a garden that flourished in Oregon's rich soil. They made friends in Willow Creek, becoming part of a community that asked no questions about their past and cared only about who they were now. When their daughter was born on a warm spring morning, they named her Rebecca Catherine McCord. She had Eleanor's green eyes and Silas's stubborn determination, and from the moment she entered the world squalling indignantly, she owned their hearts completely. 2 years later, their son followed, Jacob Samuel, named for the 2 men who'd helped save their lives. He was quieter than his sister, thoughtful and gentle, but with a core of strength that reminded Silas of his father. They raised their children in love and honesty, teaching them to be brave and kind, to fight for what was right, to never let powerful people crush the powerless. Rebecca grew up riding horses and reading poetry, while Jacob preferred working with his hands, building things like his father. Both children knew their parents' story, not the sanitized version but the truth, because Silas and Eleanor believed that truth, no matter how difficult, was always better than comfortable lies. Catherine visited every summer, bringing news from Boston and watching her niece and nephew grow with obvious delight. She never married, instead becoming a prominent advocate for women's rights, using Eleanor's story as an example of how the legal system failed to protect women from powerful men. As the years passed, Silas and Eleanor built more than just a ranch. They built a legacy. Their children grew strong and confident. Their land prospered. And every morning, they woke up together in the home they'd created, looked out over their valley, and remembered how far they'd come. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Eleanor found Silas standing on the porch at sunset, staring out at the mountains painted purple and gold by the dying light. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "The day you stepped off that train," he said. "How terrified I was. How certain I was that you'd take one look at me and run." He turned to face her, his eyes warm with the kind of love that only deepens with time and shared struggle. "How wrong I was about everything." "I was terrified too," Eleanor admitted. "I thought I was running to my death, or at best a loveless marriage of convenience. Instead, I found home. I found you. Do you ever regret it? Everything we went through? Everything we lost?" She thought about it seriously, as she always did when Silas asked difficult questions. Then she looked at their cabin, where their children's laughter drifted through the open door. She thought about the friends they'd made, the community they'd built, the life they'd carved from wilderness and hope. No, she said firmly, not for a second, because all of it, the fear, the running, the violence, all of it led us here, to this valley, to this family, to this love. I'd do it all again, Silas. Every terrible, beautiful moment. He kissed her then, soft and deep, tasting of shared history and promises kept. When they broke apart, both were smiling. You know what I think? Silas said. I think the loneliest years of my life led me to you, and I think you had to be broken down completely to find the strength to fight back. Maybe we needed to be destroyed so we could rebuild ourselves into people who deserved each other. That's very philosophical for a rancher, Eleanor teased. I married an educated woman. It was bound to rub off eventually. They stood together as the sun set completely and the first stars appeared, their children's voices a happy chorus behind them, their future stretching bright and unbounded before them. Two people who'd been thrown together by desperation and forged by fire into something unbreakable. The loner rancher had waited for an ordinary mail-order bride and received instead a woman too beautiful, too brave, too extraordinary to be believed. And she'd found in him a man willing to throw away everything, ranch, reputation, safety itself, to protect her, to love her, to build with her a life worth fighting for. Years later, when their children asked about how they met, Eleanor and Silas would share the story honestly. They'd talk about fear and courage, about corrupt systems and people who fought back, about running and surviving and never giving up hope even when darkness seemed absolute. But mostly, they'd talk about love, real love. The kind that doesn't happen in ballrooms or through pretty words, but through standing beside someone when the whole world wants them destroyed, through choosing partnership over safety, through learning that home isn't a place but a person, and that sometimes the greatest treasures come wrapped in the most desperate circumstances. Tell us the end, Rebecca would demand each time, even though she knew it by heart. And Silas would pull Eleanor close, his weathered hand finding hers with the ease of long practice, and say the same words he always did. The end is simple. Your mother didn't steal a thing. I gave her everything, my heart, my home, my future. And she gave me the same. That's not theft. That's the best trade I ever made. Eleanor would always add, and we lived. We survived and fought and loved and lived. That's the real ending. That's the only one that matters. Their children would sigh contentedly, secure in the knowledge that their parents' love was tested and proven, forged in fire, and strengthened by time. And outside, the Oregon wind would whisper through the valley they'd claimed as their own, carrying with it the promise that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the broken and hunted and desperate found exactly what they needed in each other. That truth, hard-won and fiercely protected, was the real legacy Silas and Eleanor left behind. Not just the land or the ranch or the material things they built, but the proof that love, real, honest, brave love, could survive anything, could transform anything, could make even the darkest journey worthwhile if you had the right person beside you. The loner rancher had found his home. The hunted woman had found her freedom. And together, they'd found something neither had known they were searching for until they looked across a dusty train platform and recognized in each other's eyes the answer to every question that had haunted their souls. That was their story, that was their truth, and every sunrise that painted their valley in gold, every sunset that bathed it in fire, every moment of laughter and struggle and hard-won peace, all of it stood as testimony to the simple, profound fact that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the darkest soil. They'd survived. They'd loved. They'd built a life that honored everyone who'd helped them along the way. Jacob Running Bear, who'd sacrificed his safety for theirs. Catherine, who'd fought for truth when everyone else accepted lies. The nameless townspeople who'd stood up to power on behalf of strangers. And in the end, in the quiet moments on their porch watching the stars emerge and feeling their children safe inside the home they'd built together, Silas and Eleanor knew with bone-deep certainty that every terrible thing they'd endured was worth it. Because they'd found each other. And that made everything, every fear, every loss, every moment of terror and desperation transform into something precious. Their story ended not with tragedy or bitterness, but with the simple, extraordinary triumph of two people who refused to let the world destroy them, who chose love over safety, truth over comfort, and each other over everything else. That was their legacy. That was their victory. And as the Oregon night settled soft and star-filled over their valley, as their children dreamed innocent dreams and their cattle grazed peaceful in moonlit pastures, Silas and Eleanor held each other close and knew that they'd won the only battle that truly mattered. They'd won the right to be happy, together, forever. And no power on earth could take that away from them again.